In this lesson, we will create a mini mountain landscape painting. This one will consist of 3 layers of watercolor paint. We will let it dry between each layer, starting with the background mountain, which will be the lightest in value, since it's the farthest away. As we move into the foreground trees, our values will grow darker and deeper. It's important to begin with clean, clear water. And what I'm doing here is I'm just creating an area where I will drop in my paint color. And you can see I haven't wet the entire square, just a section where my background mountain will be. I'm going to use a mixture of Davy's gray, which is a very light gray, mixed with touches of Perylene green. And I'm using lots of water so that the value stays light. I'm going to drop in just a little bit darker color and value here and there, just to create some depth within the mountain range. As you'll notice, the tops of the mountains have a hard edge, and this is because I've kept the paper dry just above that wet area. While my goal is to keep these background mountains fairly light in value, I am dropping in some darker value just to create some contrast. The bottom of this mountain range remains soft and misty because there's enough paper that's still damp for the paint to bleed into. Once your background layer of mountains has dried completely, then we can move on to the mid layer, which will consist of a medium value. Again, I'm going to use clean, clear water and just create an area on my paper where I'm going to paint my mid-range mountains. I make sure to create enough of an area so that when I drop in my paint color, the bottom will just fade and create a soft edge rather than a hard edge. Once the water has time to soak in and you can see the texture of the paper, then it's time to start dropping in your color. I'm going to make a darker mixture of my Perylene green with my Davy's gray. Because these mountains are in the middle, they're closer, they're darker in value. And just like the background mountains, I'm going to start dropping in color. And I'm going to keep the tops a hard edge as well. Now, while there's no right or wrong way to hold a brush, for this exercise, I like to hold my brush so that the top is pointing up toward the tops of this mountain range. Holding my brush like this just allows me to give the illusion of treetops poking out of this mountain range. You can see that my color is already darker in value than the distant mountain range behind it. And once this layer dries, then we will move on to the foreground trees, which will be even darker in color. One more thing that I like to do is to tilt my paper at an angle so that the paint runs down vertically. This helps to create a soft edge at the bottom of the mountains and a misty effect. For this next section of class, we will be working on our 3rd layer of watercolor, which is the foreground trees. Now we will be working on the painting that's to the right, since it's very similar to the one on the left, and for some reason I don't have footage of my foreground trees in a horizontal format. But it's essentially the same exact process. So what I'm doing is I'm putting down a layer of clean, clear water, similar to what we did before. I'm going to show this again quickly because this is an important step. I'm making sure that my clean, clear water is on the lower third of the page in a rough U shape. And this is because I'm going to keep the tops of my trees crisp, and as they move into that wet layer of water, they will fade out and create a misty effect. I'm using the darkest value of Perylene green, and I'm using a number 8 pointed round brush. As you'll notice, when I'm painting my trees, the top half of the trees is done on dry paper. This is called dry brush technique. As I begin to paint the lower half of the tree line, I'm moving into that damp paper, that clear wash that I made. And this part of the tree will just slowly fade and give a misty effect. Sometimes I enhance it using another brush like this round here. This is a number 8. It doesn't have a very fine point, but it's good for blending. And I'm holding my brush upright so that the tip is pointing up. There's no right or wrong way to hold a brush. This is just how I prefer to do my trees. I'm using a silver black velvet round. These brushes come to a very fine point and they hold quite a bit of water. And they are also synthetic. Now my treetops remain crisp, and that is because they were painted directly onto dry paper. This is a good example of creating a hard edge, and the bottom of the trees has a wet into wet effect, and this is called a soft edge. So even if I start to paint a tree trunk, it will slowly fade out, and that's the effect that I'm going for with this misty forest. You can see that my tree line bows down quite a bit, so it creates some contrast between those distant mountains and the foreground. I wanted to create some variation in this treescape just to make it interesting. The color I'm using here, Perylene green, is a very rich green, and when it's used at almost full strength, it looks almost black. So when you incorporate these wet into wet techniques and these fading effects, it's a really beautiful variation in value. I'm just going to continue adding more trees, making sure to vary the height just to give the appearance of a natural forest. I'm making sure to concentrate most of my paint at the very tops of these trees, just to further enhance that faded, misty effect down below. Keep in mind that if there's an area of your background mountains that you aren't really happy with, you can indeed cover it up with this foreground layer of trees. For instance, here I have sort of a hard edge on my background mountains, and so I'm just going to disguise it and cover it up a bit by painting a few more darker trees right in front of it. Once we've completed our foreground layer of trees, we're going to move on to painting birds. A good way to practice is to just have a scratch piece of paper nearby and to make a series of quick marks with your brush. It helps to have a pointed round. I'm using a number 6 silver black velvet because you can get very fine wing detail. I'm making a variety of different V shapes, making sure I curve one part of the wing and leaving another straight. Though there's no right or wrong way to do this, just practice. I think the best way is to just make really quick marks until you become really comfortable before moving on to your final painting. I like to create my birds in a mid-tone value, so not too dark, not too light. You can always drop in darker color while your bird is still wet. And it's also important to make them in different sizes. There will be some that are further away, and those might even be closer together. Some of your bird shapes might be upside down V's and some might just be fairly flat and straight. There's just a whole variety of different marks you can make, so it's important to practice before you move on to your painting. I usually make the birds larger as they're closer and make them darker in value. Something to keep in mind is to think of these birds as just a suggestion rather than full-on detailed. We want the focus to be on the overall landscape, not on the birds. So I like to keep them light and pretty simple. Please let me know if you've enjoyed this class, and I'd love to see your class projects. Please share them on Instagram or email me, however you choose. I would just love to see your work. Thanks again.